everyone, and welcome to our episode of Uddering Engineers podcast. It's a podcast created by engineering students for engineering students, and we're based out of the University of Calgary at the Schulich School of Engineering. Thank you for all of our listeners who listened into our first episode and have been tuning into our social media and providing us feedback. Before we get too far into this episode, we'd like to acknowledge the land that we're living on and we're working on.
Yeah, so we're sure that all of us, no matter where we're tuning in from, reside on Indigenous lands. And so, for example, Shivek and I have grown up, we've studied, we've worked, we've even planned and recorded this episode in Treaty 7 territory, which is the traditional land of the Blackfoot Nations. And that includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and also the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. So we recognize that we reside on treaty land and that in the past, these treaties have not been honored. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we celebrate that for centuries, the Inuit, the Métis, the First Nations people have lived and gathered on these lands that they call home.
Thank you, Agam. And for our listeners who may not have noticed, my co-host today is not Eric. And just as a reminder, my name is Shivek, but our co-host is not Eric today. We have a new co-host, our third co-host actually for today's episode. And I think this is a great time for her to introduce herself.
Yeah, my name is Agam. I'm actually just a second year student. So I hope to bring a different perspective to this episode. And yeah, Eric is a busy man. I'm neither of those two things. And just very excited for this episode now.
That's awesome. So what this episode is going to be focused on is accessibility in engineering. You might have been able to pick that up from our episode title. But basically what we want to focus on is the aspects of accessibility in engineering. So when we were going through our discussion and sort of some of our research, we decided to break down accessibility in engineering into two sort of subcategories. One is accessibility to engineering and the other being accessibility of engineering. Accessibility to engineering includes how you kind of get an engineering education, what ways or methods, sort of avenues you have to get that sort of education. And beyond that, how that sort of differentiates between different types of communities. And we need to acknowledge one thing here, that we are students. We have limited resources and limited data that we can pull from for some of our research. So this is going to be a little bit more anecdotal, speaking from our experiences and what we've seen. And part of that is asking our listeners for more feedback and more information. So if you have experiences that you agree with, disagree with, your observations, feel free to reach out to us. I will plug in our social media near the end of this episode, just so you stay tuned. Thanks.
So, accessibility. I guess in a more general sense, we think of engineering as a way of advancing our lives, right? And not having this discipline be accessible is essentially, it's like, well, here's a nation that's being born and that's advancing, and then here's a group of people that you're leaving behind. And you can even think of diversity itself as an asset in innovation, right? So we have to work towards our collective futures and promote programs that bring diversity and bring inclusivity.
Exactly. And I think a part of that is, as engineers, we look for problems that we want to solve. And in a lot of cases, the problems that are seen in society that need innovation, that need improvement or infrastructure, all that technology, it comes from minority communities that are seeing some of these issues, or at least some of those problems are seen there. So not including them in the technology, not including them into the education system, basically is sort of ignoring those issues, or not seeking those issues or the actual perspective of the people who are part of that community. So that's a great point you brought up, Agam. And from there, we basically want to focus in on sort of two aspects of accessibility to engineering, sort of pre-engineering and pre-education, pre-post-secondary education to being in that education. Beyond that is accessibility of engineering when it actually gets into industry. So to start off, how do we get into an engineering program? That's a question that comes up for a lot of first-year students. That's a question that comes up for a lot of high school students especially. And we know that our listeners aren't primarily high school students yet, hopefully one day. But Yeah, so how do students get into engineering? And so there are two things that we want to focus on there. One is skill development. What kinds of things, knowledge, education do you need to get into some of these programs? And the second is access to funding. Um, at the end of the day, if you have all the skills, you have the education, you have the academics, but you don't have the money to get into a school, you won't be able to get that education that you're looking for. So if we hone in onto how we develop some of those skills in high school, just an example that I want to bring up from my experiences. I spent a lot of time growing up in Ontario, and I see a big discrepancy in application processes, especially in engineering programs, where in a lot of schools out east, they're looking for, um, you know, a sort of more holistic approach of applications, where it's like, hey, we want to know what extracurriculars you're doing, if you're working a job, if you're also, what your academics look like, and they want you to basically include your entire CV and high school transcript in your application, go through an interview process, and then move from there. Which is sort of the approach that industry's been taking these days as well. But on the flip side, at least here when I was going through applications, and even now from applications I hear from high school students, the primary focus is academics. So the question here is, aren't we limiting the students or the types of students that can come into some of these programs, right? If your primary focus is just your academics, well, then students aren't trying to develop some of those skills that'll help them progress through an engineering program in their early stages. And even if they are, they can't prove them or show them in any way to be able to get that kind of education.
And one of the things that's kind of tied to this is when you're from the outside looking in, it kind of seems as if engineering, you really need to be excelling in academics, or you need to have a very, very specific skill set in order to excel and be a really good student. And of course, that's for sure like one aspect of it, but you don't need to be born with like crazy math skills and code the second you're out of the womb, right? It takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of mentorship to get to sort of these positions.
Yep. And I can sort of speak again from a personal experience there. I have struggled with math for a very long time. But the thing is, if you get the right education, you get the right mentor, you get access to the right sort of teachers, it helps you progress. So for me, my high school math teacher, I absolutely love him and I adore him and thank him for the way he taught me. Because up till then, I wasn't able to basically sort of show my work or articulate the math or the calculations that I was doing or was able to do, or even learn it appropriately. But he gave me an opportunity to sort of take a different take on it and said, visualize what you're doing on a board rather than a piece of paper. Do it with me while I'm writing notes in class. And we'll try to mark you as I'm writing notes because that's the way you learn. So I did that for some time and it helped me improve significantly in the math. And I honestly was like, okay, I like engineering, but I don't know if I'm going to get in because of, this limitation. But at the end of the day, it worked out because you look for or you find the right person to help you out. I got very lucky and fortunate that way, but that's a limitation. That's one of the things that stops you from having access to engineering.
Actually, unlike Shivek, I've had very different experiences in some aspects of learning. So as a software student, I really wanted to build my coding skills in high school. So I took a class that was offered in my school. It was just like general computer programming. And on the first day, the teacher sat down and he assigned us an essay on the history of computers. And he basically just listed a bunch of parts that we had to talk about and how they were developed. And that itself was just like too much for me because it's certainly not the way I learn. So, dropped out of that class and then I tried to do external coding classes, right? But then these classes, they had all of these like really, really advanced students. And just coming into this, I was so embarrassed to admit that I did not know what was going on. So in my sort of 19 years of life, I've realized two things. One is that I really have to be open about my developing skills. And then I have to realize that there isn't necessarily one sort of person who will be successful in engineering, right? You basically just have to be curious and collaborative to excel.
And I think that's a skill that applies across industries. So I guess our point here is engineering doesn't take the kind of academic work that people assume. there's again a lot of effort and practice that goes into it, but there's other ways to get into the program if you just have, those kinds of skills, collaborative, inquisitive skills. At the end of the day, engineers are problem solvers, and we all have different approaches to problem solving, right? Actually, somebody who doesn't have our skill set and is still able to solve those problems brings a fresh approach, and that is what creates innovation. So we should actually include other people, more inclusive of them. But moving beyond this, the second component was what was funding. How do I, once I built all these skills and actually learned all these things, now I want to get into school. I applied. I can't get in because I don't have enough funding. Well, in Canada in general, and I know this is a commentary, but again, a very big generalization. In Canada in general, we typically have decent amount of government funding to get into school, as compared to other places in the world. And local education isn't very expensive, again, as compared to most of the world. But all that being said, when you're coming from a minority community, you don't want to pick up extra loans because, typically your families have already, they're already sustaining loans. They're already in debt. You don't have too many savings to pull from to be able to get that kind of education. And now you don't want to add an external burden to that. So you either try to pick up a job, or you try to pull up scholarships. Now, most scholarships for a long time were very academic focused or leadership driven, but even the leadership driven had biases where they were in particular types of positions. Now what we've sort of noticed is there's lots of big companies, whether it's out east or here, that have sort of broadened their perspective on these scholarships. So there's more diversity focused scholarships, minority community based scholarships. And that gives a better opportunity for students to have accessibility to engineering. But we understand that there's other limitations. So if there's limitations we're missing here, that we haven't mentioned yet, please feel free to message us and let us know and come on the podcast, because we want to be able to talk about some of those things that are stopping you from getting into engineering.
Yeah, one of the goals of this podcast is to create sort of a normalized discussion on some of the trickier topics, right? So we would love to have you. But you mentioned these companies, and I think it's important to note that it's very hard to find out what the motivation behind all of these incentives are, because it could just be a marketing stunt. But at the end of the day, it goes towards helping people access engineering education, and I still think that it's quite valuable.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now that we've sort of acknowledged what it takes to get into engineering, and most of our listeners are already students in engineering, we talked about how you can develop your skills, you get your funding, you get some finances sorted out, and you get into engineering. Now, what's the next step look like? How do I have access to engineering in the program? And that next step is industry experience. How do I apply that in the future? So in the education of an engineer, we want to focus on two things from, again, our experiences. So one of them is skill development of sort of technical prowess over the engineering program. And the second one is this great buzzword that you hear all the time in post-secondary education these days, and that's networking. And the first one that we will focus on there is, skill development. How do we learn the engineering skills that we need to learn? Now, there's an interesting point here. I'm in my last year of my engineering education, and COVID happened. So my engineering education is very different than it was for 3-4 years. Everything's online now, and that's the one thing that people can relate to, sort of all around the world.
Shivek mentioned skill development, and in our schools, we normally find it through two different avenues, I would say. So one would be actually through your classes and your academics, but the other way would be like engaging with extracurricular projects. So if we were to look at just academic classes, I don't know if you also feel this, Shivek, but generally I feel like higher education courses are delivered almost as if they're like tournaments and students are vying against each other, at least maybe just in terms of a degree. But then now that we've transitioned to remote learning, the way that courses and concepts are delivered through lectures, I feel like it almost caters to a very specific type of student.
And what kind of student is that?
So that would be like students that are able to engage in Zoom lectures, right, over online lectures. Students that can go through their recorded lectures for the first few days of the week and then finish their assigned homework the next few days and then just be done for the weekend, right? So it's very like visual and auditory learning, whereas the avenues that we had that were more like hands-on learning based, or even just the community engagement, being able to talk to your TA, were quite limited in that aspect too.
Yeah, and I have to acknowledge here that at least in our school, in Schulich, the Schulich School of Engineering at University of Calgary, there has been attempts. There are attempts and pretty good attempts to allow for some of that accessibility to TAs, to professors. I know professors who've given out phone numbers, TAs who've given out their numbers. You can email us, all those kinds of things, but like you said, it's catered to a very specific type of learner. I know somebody, and I don't want to name names here, but I have a friend who, is deaf in one ear and has that disability. And what they're finding is, um, they're having they're having a lot of difficulty listening to classes and paying attention because they can't hear as well. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to focus and cue in, but a lot of these courses don't have subtitles or those kinds of those components that support the student aren't necessarily there. So they zone out and they're not able to focus in on the actual components of the lecture. They fall asleep because despite trying to focus, they just can't hear what's happening, and not able to physically engage with the person in front of them. So there's all these other limitations. And again, we do understand that you can't satisfy everybody. You're going to try your best, but we have to acknowledge that there's other people outside the sort of primary learner who also need to learn, and they're also part of engineering. I know there's acknowledgements of international students, and that's why tests have become longer, and you have more time to attempt everything. But yeah, we just need to know that there's still other people out there that aren't necessarily being supported.
And even traditionally in our regular classes, it's not that the support was available. And in understanding that, this pandemic brings quite a lot of challenges, we must realize that it's not the responsibility of just the professor to think of innovative ways to approach these problems, but it's more of like, faculty or the university that gets to decide how we pivot on. And actually, one of the things that I've realized is that online delivery of university courses have brought more avenues that are helpful and that are actually positive to learning, right? So recorded lectures, for example, that helps me manage time better because instead of, going to school for 4 to 5 hours and then coming back, doing like 4 to 5 hours of homework, and then, I don't know, maybe some students might even have work after that. Having more succinct delivery of course materials is helpful in learning.
Definitely, I think there's a component there that we sort of acknowledged where there's no tactile component to learning, when it's everything's online, which means I can't do my labs or tutorials in person, and at least as a mechanical engineer, it's difficult for me to understand some principles just from online learning. Although we'll always try our best to do that, and professors try their best to teach us. And there have been attempts from professors to, at least some classes I know, where they're like, okay, you know what, collect all these materials you have at home. We can prove a mechanical principle just by running a test at home. You have these tools. We can do this. But then on the flip side, there's machines and multi-million-dollar labs that are built for that education. So there is that limitation. But like Aga mentioned, there's huge benefit to having access to lectures and notes, course notes at any point. Helps with time management. It's for me. It's also true. It's been able to help me because I guess the expectation for a student, and this is just post-secondary education in general, I think, but the expectation for a student is, go to classes, spend time learning about your classes and practicing and all of that. So 4 to 5 to 6 to 8 hours per class. And every professor has a slightly different expectation. You do all these practices, you do your labs, you do your assignments. That's one thing. Extracurriculars, that's another set of hours. Now, beyond that, you have, your home, responsibilities. That's another set of hours. By the time you get to the end of the week, you're sitting at like 60 to almost 80 hours, um, depending on the person. How do you time manage your lectures around all of that, right? And sometimes you even go to a lecture and you take notes, but none of that goes in. So being able to look at those notes definitely helps. And we understand, being co-hosts, that our approach to learning is different, Agam and I. So if you realize that you learn a different way and the online learning is just not working for you, then feel free to message us again on our social media, or find us on our social media, and let us know what's what are components of online learning you don't like. The biggest complaint I've heard so far is being able to engage with people. That's the thing that people are missing out on the most. Not even the classes necessarily, but I can't interact with my friends. I don't get to meet the people. I don't get to meet TAs. That's what's been stopping people, which is networking. And that I'm going to use to segue to our next point. Networking is sort of the second component to that, right? How do you build a network to be able to get into the engineering industry? And it's a big question, and we know we're going to try answering, how to network in engineering in a different episode. But just to sort of summarize, how can someone network when they don't know where to start? How can someone network when their families or their experiences or their own home personal network doesn't have engineers in it? Where do you begin, and how do you get access to that industry experience?
Yeah, so in my experience, I feel like the first step to networking actually begins from your family or your personal connections, right? And then when we look at minority communities, for example, a lot of our families may not have any engineers, or maybe there might be engineers, but they haven't been able to get towards higher management level positions, right? And even like thinking historically, for example, before the 1970s, we had indigenous peoples that they couldn't pursue post-secondary education without the fear of losing their status, right? So that example that example was a very deliberate and forceful way of keeping people from succeeding. But if your parents or your grandparents weren't able to go on, then where would you really begin networking from?
Definitely, and a lot of the times there's already other types of strains and stresses, within a family. That's kind of normal. But what happens in a lot of cases, at least from the people I've talked to in minority communities, um, the ability to be able to comfortably speak to people and be sort of outgoing is not inherent to everyone. So what that means is, even if I have the network, even if Schulich provides me all of these resources, and ESS puts all these events on, and I show people where to go or whatever needs to happen, I still don't know how to comfortably speak to somebody to start a conversation to get to that endpoint, right? And at the end of the day, the answer to that is practice. You got to start somewhere and move on from there. And like we said, we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in another episode. But you got to start somewhere. You got to start talking to people, and that's how you sort of develop that one network and work from there. And having limitations on that network is a whole sort of different issue. Like, I mean, again, I don't want to name names, but there's every school sort of has elite programs where either they're scholars or other types of people that come into these programs, where they came out of these programs from high school. They have access to all of these specific industry networks and alumni and all of that kind of thing. But now that kind of becomes sort of its own group, its sort of own elite status, where they can tap into all of these things. Whereas somebody who wasn't able to develop those skills in high school and was finally able to pick up on them and learn all of them and was super engaged in school can no longer tap into that network, because in high school they didn't have that ability, right? So making sure that there's a bridge between those two. Can somebody who was able to develop all these skills and become, a promising, great student, somebody who has potential, is motivated to learn, is a good engineer at the end of the day, how do they get access to this network and able to provide, their skills to the industry? And I have to say one more thing here. Sorry, I don't have the answer to this question. It's just something that we've seen, and I'm questioning. It's something that we've, seen out there in the education system, and I, again, don't have the answer to this. but I'm sure there's a solution.
Yeah, and in working towards a solution, I know that Schulich and ESS has done actually quite a lot, right? So this was just like in first year, but I would always see like career fairs. I would always see just networking events hosted by the ESS or hosted by Schulich or just the University of Calgary. And this, I feel like, was a really great way to practice networking, because the best practice, as you mentioned, is just to get your feet wet, just to take a step in. And now networking online is certainly another challenge that we can talk about in our networking episode.
Definitely. And I guess just one tip I'm going to drop here for networking that, at least, again, I've seen and heard has been very valuable. Um, when networking, talking to people, great. Usually that ends up coming pretty easy relative to everything else. But the biggest thing people miss out on networking is follow up. Get the person's information, talk to them, create some banter, and follow up with them after that discussion the next week, the next month. Make sure that connection sticks, because that's where the value comes in at the end of the day, right? They know you're actually interested. And even if they can't help you get a job, they're a great person to speak to. Um, that's Keep that in mind. But besides that, so we've sort of touched on these four components as a part of engineering, access to engineering as a whole. So post-secondary education and during post-secondary education. And as a summary, pre was skill development, as well as scholarships and funding or financing options. And then during post-secondary education, that's again skill development and networking, right? But there's a thing here that we sort of found in our preparation for this episode. I think Dr. Morshipur was the one who posted some research.
Yeah, so Dr. Moshapur, many of our listeners might know actually about this program, but he runs Schulich Ignite, which is basically trying to address some of the barriers that we've brought up throughout this episode. And he published this paper with a graduate student and another professor, basically trying to bring up ways that we can adjust our programs, adjust some extracurricular involvements that we have with high school students to help them better succeed within engineering. And some of the insights that they gathered was that we really need to start focusing on active project-based learning earlier on in education. So throughout like elementary, middle school, and then high school as well. And then this also kind of ties into the next point that they looked into, but we also need to encourage more extracurricular projects. So usually, for example, students stumble into programming on their own. And for me, like this whole self-discovery program was a bit of a challenge, and it was a bit of a deterrent. So we should start looking into opportunities for the kids that wouldn't necessarily have engaged in these projects to actually be able to pick up the skills that they need. And then the last and the final thing that they bring up is formal mentorship. So this would be actually recruiting students that have experienced these barriers, that have gone on to excel, and then having them come back and just mentor the students that are facing them right now.
Definitely. I think that's an amazing breakdown. But I think if you notice, this is something that ties into, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, where we were talking about schools out east and here, where there's a holistic approach to a student as opposed to just an academic approach, right? If you look here, there's the academic component talking about active-based projects and just academics in general, but then there's extracurriculars. There's the networking component and formal mentorship, right? The accessibility to engineering changes based on what's being provided to the students. And I think these three components, active project-based learning, related extracurricular projects, and formal mentorship are key, not just for high school students, but even throughout our education in engineering, right? We pay for school not just to go to class. We pay for school to pick up all of these things as well, because it's easier to access all of these experiences in university than it is outside of university. That's just something to keep in mind. And using this to sort of end our episode and sort of come to terms with this discussion, we will be talking about accessibility of engineering in a follow-up episode, sort of part 2 of this. But we want to acknowledge that Schulich and University of Calgary and the community around us does have resources to help with some of this accessibility. We talked about Alberta student loans. We talked about some scholarships, and there's databases out there for that. But there's also the Accessibility Center at the University of Calgary that helps you sort of helps support you through your education, whether it be getting more times on exams or sort of learning what type of learner you are, as well as academic advisors, whether it be in Schulich or outside of that. But there are resources out there, and I think one of the best resources out there also are upper years. And I'm not just speaking about this because I'm an upper year. It's more because upper years are more than willing to support and help out students, and sort of provide them guidance. We've been through the sort of same struggle. We've hit the same walls. It's happened over and over again. So let's work on it together and try to improve the workflow and the experience of the students going through the programs now.
Yeah, and I know that Schulich has actually done a lot of work through their programs to address these barriers, right? Their focus is really on developing a long-term relationship with communities to understand their needs, and then making special bridge programs and specialized orientation programs as well. And then as students, if we don't see programs that we think would have been helpful for ourselves in high school or in earlier years of engineering, then it's also our job to start contributing, to start pestering faculty and administration to make these sort of programs that we need.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we have to advocate for ourselves, right? Whether it be through a known body like the Engineering Student Society, the Students Union, or what sort of avenues we have there. Yeah, I think our biggest thing that we want to mention from this episode is, again, at the end of the day, this is a commentary from our experiences and our sort of breakdown of accessibility to engineering. So feel free to message us on our social media. Feel free to give us some feedback about discussions or parts of the discussion that we've missed out on. You can find us on Instagram under at Uddering Engineers. You can also find us on YouTube. If you just search up Uddering Engineers, you can find us on Facebook under the Engineering Student Society banner. Feel free to message us and provide us some feedback. We know we're new to this. We know this podcast is new. So there's things that we need to work on, and we want to talk about topics that people want to hear. That brings us to the end. So thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. This has been episode 2 of Uddering Engineers podcast. It's a podcast created by engineers for engineers. And now that we've spoken about accessibility, it's also made for people outside of engineering who might be interested in some of the things that we talk about.